Greetings all! Upon the suggestion of one of his viewers, Bernard over at Military History Visualized invited me to comment upon the video he recently did entitled The Panzergrenadier Commandments, with an eye to giving a moderately experienced modern assessment of it. Okay, so here it is. These commandments are for what we would today consider a mechanized infantry company of approximately 200 personnel in armored half-tracks and are dated July 1943, with the benefit of a fair bit of practical experience at this point, mainly on the Russian front. There are 30 of these commandments in total. The first commandment is that the company commander is to make copies of the route for each of the platoon leaders in order to prevent copying/listening errors. In a more modern parlance, it would be that we would give the overlays to the platoon leaders. This strikes me as a very surprising lack of trust in the subordinates in an army renowned for giving lower ranks autonomy and self-direction. In US Army today, the overlay is simply made available and is then copied by the subordinates. Now granted, if you're not worried about the manual backups, you can just send the overlay by email on the battlefield management system. But that capability obviously wasn't an option back then. If you want to be sure the message gets across correctly, there are two mechanisms for doing so: the confirmation brief and the back brief. The confirmation brief is basically a QA check. As soon as you've given your instruction, you then ask questions to ensure that the messages you gave were received. Then, when the subordinates have created their plan, they brief you back, which is your opportunity to catch errors. 2. Keep communication to both front and rear. Stay together. Don't lose anyone. This is de facto, and in a vehicular convoy, normally someone in the vehicle is detailed to keep an eye on the vehicle behind, in order to notify you should it drop out of march. Today, with radios, control is far easier, but the visual contact is still maintained. As an aside, I try as much as possible to get my own troops to abandon US doctrine when walking in file, and use what the Irish taught me, and I believe the British do the same thing. For whatever reason, in the US, they say that the guy at the tail end of the column walks backwards and he covers the rear. Far better to have him face forward and have the second from last guy walking backwards. 3. The slowest vehicle determines the speed of the convoy. This should be common sense, and I wonder why they felt the need to reiterate this as a commandment. 4. Vehicle commanders stand and stick their heads out. If they sit, they get complacent. Now, I suspect this is referring to the tactical issues of spotting the enemy, but a convoy will often require attention to be paid to all sorts of strangeness, such as road quality, civilian traffic, whatever. For a tank, this is easy. I recall one of my first exercises in piss and rain at night. My loader just looks at me, says, "Sorry sir," gets down and closes hatch. Well, I stayed out and soaked during a road march. Now, of course, if contact were expected, I might have kept him out anyway. An interesting dilemma cropped up with the Humvee. Normally, the vehicle commander is in the front passenger seat. However, I have encountered a number of personnel who commanded their vehicle from the turret, on the basis that they could actually see the outside world. Now, personally, I would think that the VC or platoon leader would have better things to be doing in a fight than manning the machine gun, but given the battlefield management system is now installed in the front passenger seat of a Humvee, I think those days of the guy in charge manning the weapon are over anyway. 5. When in constricted terrain, ground guide your vehicles, i.e. get off and do hand signals. Again, this is something which I'm amazed needs to be stated as a mid-war commandment. It's something which should be a no-brainer. Number 6 is fairly specific to the half-track company. I'm going to run out of fingers by the time we get to 30. Anyway, specific to the half-track company, but even today, the recovery vehicle is usually found towards the end of the convoy. When a vehicle breaks down, it just pulls over when it reaches it. 7 says that in poor terrain, the less capable off-road vehicles should be alternated with the half-tracks and the tow ropes kept free. Now, I don't know if we ever really got to the alternating idea, as modern military vehicles are far more capable off-road than World War II German trucks, and like type, such as Humvees, are usually able to pull each other out when they do get stuck. but the tow rope is still done. On most tanks or IFVs, the tow cables have a specific mounting point for stowage, and the clevises are kept in the stowage bins. In the field though, we kept them out and half mounted. The clevises will be attached to all four corners, and the ropes will be mounted loosely on the front or the rear. The front cable would have one end attached to the front right clevis on the tank and the rear cable on the rear left. That way, if a tank bogged down, it was very quick to do a rapid recovery. Just drive one tank up to the other, grab the two loose ends, hook them up to the opposite tank's empty clevises and just pull out. By placing the cables on opposite corners, it didn't matter if you went nose to nose, nose to tail, or tail to tail, although tail to tail could get a little bit warm in an M1. I'm intrigued by the remark in the commandment that the tow rope on a truck should be affixed to the front axle. This strikes me as being a great way to turn a truck into a bicycle, as normally one would affix the rope to the frame. Either there is something unusual about German World War II trucks, or the commandments were written by somebody without any great practical automotive knowledge. Given the level of motorization in German society in World War II, the latter is entirely feasible, even at the general staff level. I don't know enough about motorcycle sidecars, especially powered ones, to comment upon their towing technique. Commandment 8 probably loses something in translation. Bernard assures me that it refers to the back end of the convoy, which I guess does mean that the officer can keep an eye on the convoy head to make sure nobody's doing any unauthorized overtaking and that everybody is making progress. Quite why he needs a motorcycle messenger to let him know what's going on in the convoy, I'm not sure, because presumably he has a radio and a pair of eyes, and I really don't quite understand the purpose of the second motorcyclist at all. I don't know about energetic officers, but I would prefer to think that somebody who can read a map ought to be up front. And not just to follow the route, but also to be able to react to problems on the route, such as blockages, and figure out how to get around them. This seems to me to be more of a good use of a good officer than internal traffic control, which all of your vehicle commanders, I would have thought, ought to have a handle on. Number 9 is throw vehicles from different units ruthlessly out of your column, otherwise they will turn somewhere and with them the rest of your column. Can confirm. January 2005. We are being escorted into Mosul, where we had never before been, by a unit we had never before met, Deuce 4 Infantry. Basically, we were playing follow the leader from the city limits to the base. My platoon and the company XO and tail, possibly a little bit too far behind, driving north at the Yarmouk traffic circle, a convoy from 101st Airborne intermingles with our convoy from a different entry road, and then they split off at an earlier off-road than ours. Well, about a half mile south, we cop on that the XO's tank isn't behind us. Turned out he followed the airborne guys north, and the wheeled, they didn't wait up for him. So we now have a stranded first lieutenant in bandit country in a tank on his own in a city. We did get him back. Of course, there is a difference between the principle and the action of ruthlessly throwing vehicles out of your convoy. The convoy is not going to stop for you to have a chat, and you probably don't have a radio which talks to them. Best you can do is use the fact that you're in an armored vehicle and perhaps gently nudge the offender. In our case, the merge and split happened so quickly we didn't even notice that one unit that we didn't know had merged with a different unit that we didn't know at a place that we didn't know. So, definitely worthy advice. Now, unfortunately, it is probably easier said than done. Number 10 refers to traffic jams. If you're in a traffic jam or very slow traffic, it says just pull your convoy over, stop, and cut the engines until the vehicles in front have made some distance. Then switch on your engines, catch up at marked speed. Also gives you drivers a rest. For what it's worth, this is the recommended process in civilian traffic as well, more or less. Things smooth out much more nicely if you don't follow the tail of the car in front, going from 0 to 20 and back to 0 again. Much better to travel at a steady, say, 10. Human nature, unfortunately, doesn't work that way, and if you do leave a gap, because you're doing 10 for that moment that the other guy's doing 20, somebody will change lanes into it in front of you, instead of just slowing down himself in his own lane. which means then that you have to drop down to 5. And it goes haywire from there. It is my firm opinion that most of the horrible traffic that I observed in Russia is caused by people ignoring traffic laws and plain courtesy in order to try to bypass the horrible traffic. I am honestly intrigued as to whether Russians who come on vacation to America and rent a car attempt to drive the same way in, say, Los Angeles traffic as they do in Moscow. Number 11 also caused some discussion between Bernard and myself. We are agreed, and he says indeed in the video, that the first sentence is just plain weird. But we are also agreed that it means that in the event of a hold-up, the leaders have to go find out what happened, and presumably deal with it. The second sentence, to me, is a non sequitur, and I don't think we've come to a common agreement. Bernard is of the opinion that it means exactly what it says, that more often than not, the reason a convoy has come to a halt is because of a tired driver. We are both agreed that it seems a little bit illogical to us, but he's going with what's written. Personally, I would think that falling asleep is more normally the consequence of the convoy stopping for some other reason, like a breakdown, road blockage, or just the guy up front being stopped at an intersection and trying to figure out which way to go next. I wondered if it means mentally falling asleep at the wheel, but Bernard assures me that he literally means falling asleep. So make of that line what you will. In any case, today one of the jobs of a co-driver is to keep the driver awake. I'm unsure about the need for number 12, using the motorcyclist to drive down the length of the convoy, banging on doors in order to make sure everybody's awake before the convoy sets off. If it were a long-term stop, I can perhaps see the idea of just keeping 1 or 2 folks in the company awake, everybody else sleeps, and a motorcyclist would indeed be a very convenient way of getting around to everybody to wake them up. But if it's many stops, as written in the commandment, I would presume that at least the vehicle will go to, say, 25 or 50% watch. The army does still teach hand signals for tanks as well to get us going, but these days there's only one signal commonly actually used. It's the "I'm ready, are you ready?" Signal is given by the guy in front to the back and is passed down to the vehicle at the very end. When the last vehicle signals "I'm ready," then the signal is sent back up the chain to the front, and when the front guy gets it, they're ready to go off your gun. Infantrymen stacking at the door do something similar. They kind of will lean back and then lean forward pressure and take the momentum. 13. Officers, NCOs, let the drivers drive. And this is similar to the issue I mentioned before, vehicle commanders commandeering the machine gun turrets, but is even worse. 14 can probably be the topic of a long discussion. The instruction almost seems to indicate that low ground is the rarity rather than the rule. After all, they want to make progress. Now, this could be a factor of the infamous Russian mud being in the low ground and a desire to avoid it. Today, though, low ground is your friend. Tanks go as the waters flow, as they say, and we don't stick our noses up above the surrounding level unless we have to. I mean, why advertise where you are? The idea of setting vehicles out of security for a long convoy can indeed be sensible enough. For example, if you're crossing a linear obstacle, you will set up near and far side security as everybody else passes. But after doing so, you either have to change the sequence of vehicles in your convoy, or the security vehicles have to find a way to work their way back up to the front again. I would think that this instruction really would only apply in a limited set of circumstances which involve a high probability of enemy contact. 15. Better to be 50 meters too far into cover than 1 centimeter outside. And no argument there. Interestingly, the examples of concealment given, such as staying in the shadow of buildings and trees or covering up tracks leading into trees, are also to be found in the US Army's manual of the 1940s. Now, number 16 is another example of why on earth does this need to be written out as an important commandment? Were Armored Panzergrenadier Company commanders that inexperienced with vehicle operations that they didn't, as a default, insist on 2-vehicle operation? Did not the experienced NCO slap the officer around a bit who suggested such a solo reconnaissance? Now, I did, granted, occasionally have to run a single tank in my platoon in company with the 2 Humvees that made up my mixed platoon due to breakdown. I didn't have a second tank. But those days always gave me heart palpitations. When I was considering in the tank museum the desire to send a tank to partake in a Veterans Day parade, the very first question out of my mouth is, what's the recovery plan? Always, if you can, send 2 vehicles of the heaviest weight class out so that one can tow the other, as well as anything else. And that's just the issue of breakdowns and getting mired or otherwise stuck. There is a form of reconnaissance called Recon by death, or in vehicular terms, auto-combustible reconnaissance. It is not the preferred technique, but on occasion it does happen that you discover the enemy when they shoot at you, and they may not miss. A single vehicle on its own which blows up will merely tell you, the commander, that, well, the enemy are out there somewhere and they are not friendly. If your vehicle had a friend along, at least that friend should be able to report what the hell just happened to the first guy. Number 17 also seems to be something of a no-brainer and begs the question of what they're teaching their company commanders. Now, granted, I may be doing them a disservice. It very well may be that at the time, say, the British and the Americans didn't do a terrain analysis before going somewhere either. Today, the S2 shop loves to do McCoos. Obstacle overlays, which basically split up the terrain into sections like no-go, slow-go, clear, dominating feature, and the like. Although I think recently Doctrine has said that no-go is no longer a thing. Not sure I agree with that. Basically, when you come up with your plan, make sure that the ground you plan to cover will take your vehicles. I'm going to assume that at least the tactical, as opposed to mobility aspects of the terrain, would be taken into account without the need of resorting to a commandment. 18. Again, who isn't following this already? A support by fire position does precisely that. It permits other maneuver elements to get forward by, at worst, suppressing the enemy. If you're attacking, why wouldn't you be using your heaviest weapons possible? They don't contribute anything sitting in the back. You know those movies where you start with a small weapon against someone or something and gradually move to bigger and bigger weapons before finally getting to the biggest damn thing you have, which works? Just start with the biggest damn thing you have if you have the ammo. Looking at you, Bert Gummer. Now, with number 19, we are returning to the world of lessons apparently learned by experience. The theory is sound. Yes, the half-tracks are armoured, but they're open-topped and Soviet artillery might have some rounds fused to explode above the open vehicles. So overall, it's probably safer for them just to hang back a bit. The difficult piece in this occurs in the timing. You would presume that the best time to move forward is more or less when the panzers get so close to the Soviet lines that artillery, the German artillery, has to shift forward. The friendly artillery would then be required to prevent the aforementioned Soviet anti-tank infantry from having a field day. So you got to balance. You want to avoid moving too early and getting blasted by Soviet artillery, and you don't want to be too late and get there in time to support disabled panzers. Probably better to err on the side of early though. After all, those anti-tank rifles currently being suppressed by your artillery can be used against you during the approach as well. Number 20 seems fair enough. What is interesting here is that it seems to be an open question as to whether the infantry are fighting alongside the tanks or with the tanks. It's an interesting problem that many countries had, and the infantry radios often didn't talk well to the tank radios. By early 1943, Panzergrenadier Company commanders would start receiving 251/3s, which had radios which definitely could talk to the tanks, but that doesn't really help the platoon and low-level folks. Even if a unit trained with the tanks it was to accompany, I suspect that the level of coordination attained after being separated and then charging across the battlefield to link up again is going to be somewhat questionable. Bernard does have a video up covering the doctrine of tank infantry cooperation, but he doesn't seem to have anything which covers the technical problem of just how it's done. So I'm going to write that one off as I don't know, and leave it for others to tell me just which radios could talk to which in what time frame. 21. The driver should engage with a submachine gun. Situational, I would say, and I'm not sure whether or not the benefit of opening up his front hatch to spray out and also distract him from driving is worthwhile. Still, obviously the Germans felt so. 22 can simply be translated into watch your arcs of fire, and is another matter of asking what was going wrong and that they felt it was necessary to put this in. 23. After another clarification session with Bernard, this basically means follow the tracks of the vehicles in front. Again, I'm not sure why this needs to be stated. It is, in fairness, an interesting problem today with mines which are set to detonate upon the second or even later number of presses to avoid either being detonated by a roller or to hit a later, perhaps more valuable vehicle in the convoy. But it's probably still better than you taking your chances. 24 also hardly seems like a revelation. The 251 is an armoured half-track, but it's not a tank. The way to survive is to not get hit in the first place, which, in fairness, is probably pretty good advice if you're in a tank as well. Stay in low ground, move fast, fire from the short halt, and gain fire superiority to keep their heads down. That hasn't changed. 25 is interesting. You would expect that mechanized infantry would take the PC to the battle and then get out to fight with a half-track a little behind and support the machine gun. And indeed, that's more or less how it was originally to be done. But you see here the change in doctrine which Bernard mentions. By 1944, fighting mounted was German doctrine. That said, there are a couple of comments I would make in response to this. Firstly, fighting mounted isn't actually necessarily all that different to today. If the terrain is something like trenches, buildings, etc., something which needs dismounted troops to clear, then yes, the infantry will get out of the Bradley. If it seems likely that the defences include good anti-tank weapons, yes, the infantry will get out of the Bradley, so they're not killed in the Bradley. The other, which may be worth noting, is the emphasis on bypass. Bearing in mind that the German military was a force of maneuver, if they dismounted to deal with the remnants of the Soviet lines, it would result in a very long delay while they do it and then remount. Let the follow-on forces deal with that problem, making progress in retaining the operational initiatives far more important. Number 26 is sensible, and Bernard correctly notes that they consider that preparation to move was more important than noise discipline. Setting out an LPOP from your logger is sensible enough, but in today's world it's an interesting dilemma between keeping your vehicles hidden and keeping them exposed enough that the thermals can see. The thermals will be better at spotting the enemy approaching than an LPOP 100 or 200 yards out, and handheld thermals are not really a thing in a tank company. They will, however, be a thing in a modern mech infantry company. Even if the thermal sights for the machine guns are not an issue, the Javelin CLUs can be used for the role, if sparingly, as the batteries will drain. The second part of the commandment may seem counterintuitive, but bear in mind that if the enemy is attacking you, there's a good chance that it's because they've already scoped out your position and think that they can win, even if you're on the defense. Since the Panzergrenadier company hallmark is mobility, then why not use it? 27 I flat disagree with. Even if every tracer does ignite the fuel, and I'm somewhat suspicious as to what the relative requirements are for oxygen needed for combustion in a full jerry can combined with the temperature of the tracer round, the fire which results from the half-track should fall down to the ground. Note the common storage of POL on Soviet tank exteriors, or especially the S-tank. And should a round, like an ATR round, punch through the armour of the half-tracks and then a jerry can on the inside, the fire which ignites as a result would probably be far worse for the guys than, the vehicle as well, than if the jerry can were on the outside of the vehicle. It would be very interesting to know why the Germans decided to go with this route for advice. Bernard and myself are actually not seeing particularly eye to eye on this one. 28 is reasonable. One of the basic tenets of command is to always have a reserve, even if it's very small. If you do have to commit your reserve, then find a way to create a new one. The Germans always considered a counterattack as part of their defensive techniques, and with good reason. If you can gain the initiative, you can regain control of the fight. 29 shows an interesting counterpoint to the American experience. In Italy, one of the frequent calls was for a tiny TIM generator to be mounted on the M10s. They were using the radios a lot and were running the main diesels to power them. The tanks, of course, have their own little Joe auxiliary motors, and running the engine on a half-track Jeep or Scout car hardly makes a huge dent in the American supply problem. It is perhaps indicative of the relative supply issues that the German preference was to use the radios less presumably to save fuel, whilst the American preference was to use the radio more, even at the cost of fuel. Given how important the radio proved to be to the German way of war in the first part of the war, it is significant that they were instructed to use it sparingly. Finally, number 30. The radio is useless if nobody's wearing the headset to hear it or transmit information. File this one also under, why does this need to be reinforced? Overall, these commandments seem to me to be maybe one or two more questions than answers. Just how sloppy were the Germans getting, either due to overconfidence or lack of discipline or training, that some of these things needed to be put out army-wide? Few of them are wrong, but many should be so fundamental that they shouldn't need to be re-emphasized in a top 30 document in the first place. A couple are obviously lessons learned though as a result of hard experience. So anyway, that's my little opinion piece done. I'll see you on the next one.